Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. A podcast that's about more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories. The unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for being here. You know, I owe you all a bit of an apology. I know it's been a few weeks since I've put out a new episode, and to make that worse, the new episode you've been waiting for is the final part, this part, of a 5-part story we've been telling. So that's really kind of a crappy thing to do. I'm sorry about it. My life just got super busy. The school year ended. My daughter, who I'm so proud of, starred as one of the Queens, Catherine Parr, in a junior version of the musical Six. She did an amazing job. My parents came and visited so that they could see that musical. And then immediately following that, the family traveled to Seattle for our cousin's college graduation. And as soon as we got home, I had to get the girls off to summer camp. So anyway, my life just got a little nuts in a very compacted period, and I couldn't manage to get the podcast out. So I do apologize for the wait. I am still here. The show is still cranking along. And you have arrived at Part 5, the final part of Kinda Murdery's investigation of the murder of Betsy Faria. I am Zevin Odelberg. This is Kinda Murdery. I am so thankful that you are here with me. And because this is Part 5, if you haven't heard Parts 1 through 4 yet, go back and listen to them. I will save you a seat. But with no further ado, let's get down to business. Part 5, the conclusion of Kinda Murdery's investigation of the murder of Betsy Faria, starts now. The conviction landed in the courtroom with the kind of quiet that doesn't feel quiet while you're sitting inside it. Russ Faria had walked in still insisting he did not kill his wife. By the time the jury came back, the state's version had beaten the room into shape. Husband, sick wife, knife, blood, rage, motive. A marriage prosecutors had said had been rotting underneath everything else. Joel Schwartz stood beside Russ when the verdict came down. Guilty, first-degree murder. Russ did not collapse. He did not shout over the judge. He stood there with the stunned, rigid look of a man hearing something impossible spoken in a room where impossible things still become official. The people who believed in him sat behind him with the same sickened stillness, looking at the jury box, then at Russ, then at the lawyers who had already started thinking about what came next. Pam Hupp walked out of the first trial as one of the state's most important witnesses, and for a while the public version of the story held. She had told investigators that Betsy feared Russ. She had helped frame the emotional shape of the marriage. Prosecutors had used that shape to make the physical violence inside the house feel like it belonged to the husband. Russ went to prison with a life sentence attached to his name. Outside prison, the people who stood by him did not have the luxury of moving on. His friends from game night still had the same problem they had carried from the beginning. Their memories of that night did not fit the story the state had told the court. The jury had heard enough to convict him, but the people who sat with Russ that evening kept returning to the clock, the drive, the distance, and the narrow window prosecutors still said held a murder. Joel Schwartz did not treat the verdict like the end of the case. He treated it like the next room he had to walk into. The first trial had blocked him from putting Pam Hupp at the center of the defense the way he wanted. He had been limited in what he could ask, limited in what he could tell the jury, limited in how directly he could point to the woman who had been made beneficiary of Betsy's life insurance policy days before the murder. After the conviction, those limits became part of the fight. Schwartz kept working through the file, not like a man polishing old arguments, but like somebody checking a locked door for a hinge that nobody else noticed. He went back to statements, back to timelines, back to what Pam said, when she said it, and how often the details shifted. In prison, Russ lived inside the consequences of a story he said was false. The outside world kept moving. Court filings moved slowly. Appeals moved slower. Days in prison did not care whether a man said he was innocent. They started, ended, and started again under the same rules as every other sentence being served around him. He still wore his wedding ring. He still said he loved Betsy. He still said he did not kill her. Those words did not open the prison gates. What mattered now was paper, motions, transcripts, arguments about what the first jury never heard. Schwartz and the defense team had to find a way to put the missing parts of the case back in front of a judge. Pam's insurance money, her shifting statements, the timeline that never stopped fighting the prosecution's version of the night. The first crack did not look like a movie twist. It looked like legal work. Slow, dry, stubborn legal work. Motions filed, records reviewed, testimony compared against documents that had been sitting in the case file, waiting for someone to refuse the easy version. The question was no longer whether Russ had received a fair trial. It was whether the first trial had kept the jury from hearing the parts of the case that made the state's version much less clean. Pam Hupp's name moved differently through the defense file now, not as background, not as the helpful friend, not as the woman who explained Betsy's fear. Instead, she was the person closest to the money, closest to the last ride home, and closest to the version of Betsy's marriage that helped send Russ Faria to prison. Joel Schwartz's fight for a new trial did not hinge on proving who killed Betsy, not yet. The immediate battle was smaller, and in some ways, more important. He needed to convince the court that the first jury had not been allowed to hear evidence that mattered. That argument pulled the case back into court. Transcripts from the original trial were spread across desks and conference tables while Schwartz's team worked through them line by line. The question kept returning to the same place. What happens when jurors hear only part of a story? The defense argued that the jury should have been allowed to hear more about Pam Hupp, particularly her connection to the life insurance money, and the extent to which she benefited financially after Betsy's death. The conviction remained in place. Russ remained in prison. But for the first time since the verdict, the foundation beneath the conviction had started moving again. The insurance policy sat at the center of those arguments. Before Betsy's murder, the beneficiary designation on her $150,000 life insurance policy had changed. The money was no longer going to Russ. It was going to Pam. That fact had always existed. It had never been hidden. What changed was the importance people assigned to it. At trial, prosecutors viewed the policy largely through the lens of Betsy's alleged fears about Russ. The defense viewed it differently. To Schwartz, the policy represented something far more significant, a financial motive attached directly to a witness the jury had largely been encouraged to trust. The more he examined the surrounding circumstances, the more difficult it became to treat the policy as a minor detail. Pam had received money. Russ had received a life sentence. Those two facts occupied the same case file. Outside the courtroom, support for Russ continued growing, not dramatically, gradually. People who had followed the case closely started reading deeper than headlines. Friends and family members organized records, compared court filings, and spent long evenings discussing the pieces of the prosecution's story that continued bothering them. The conviction itself had changed the emotional landscape. Before the verdict, people debated what might happen. After the verdict, they had something concrete to examine, and some of what they found unsettled them. The timeline still felt compressed. Pam's role still felt unusually influential. The insurance money still seemed difficult to ignore. One supporter later described the experience as watching a puzzle become less clear the longer you looked at it. The state had presented certainty. The underlying details felt increasingly messy. That gap became impossible for some people to stop thinking about. As defense attorneys continued digging, another pattern started attracting attention. Pam often appeared at critical points throughout the story, not merely present, central. She drove Betsy home from chemotherapy. She received the life insurance proceeds. She became one of the prosecution's most important emotional witnesses. She helped define how investigators and jurors understood Betsy's relationship with Russ. Individually, none of those facts proved anything. Together, they created a concentration of significance that defense attorneys found increasingly difficult to dismiss. One investigator spent an afternoon mapping major events from the final months of Betsy's life onto a timeline covering the entire wall of the office. By the time he stepped back, Pam's name appeared repeatedly across the board, not because somebody forced it there, because it kept appearing in the underlying facts. Then came the ruling that changed everything. Judge Chris McDonough reviewed the arguments surrounding the first trial and reached a conclusion that sent a shock through the case. The defense had been improperly restricted from presenting evidence concerning Pam Hupp and the insurance money. The jury had not been allowed to hear information that could have materially affected how they viewed the case. Russ Faria's conviction was overturned. The ruling did not declare him innocent. It did something almost as important. It reopened the door. After years behind bars, Russ walked out of prison while prosecutors prepared for a second trial. Cameras gathered outside. Reporters crowded the scene. Family and supporters waited nearby. For the first time since the guilty verdict, Russ was no longer fighting from inside a prison cell. And for the first time, Pam Hupp's role in the case was moving from the margins toward the center of the story. The second trial felt different before it even started. The first case had moved forward with the momentum of a story people thought they understood. By the time Russ sat through the second prosecution, that certainty no longer existed. Too many questions had survived the years between trials. Too many people had spent too much time examining the cracks. Most importantly, the jury was going to hear things that the first jury never did. The life insurance money, Pam Hupp's role, the beneficiary change. The defense no longer had to fight with one hand tied behind its back. Joel Schwartz understood that better than anyone in the courtroom. The case was still difficult. Russ was still accused of murdering his wife, but the battlefield itself had changed. And once a jury hears a different story, it becomes much harder to pretend the first story was the only one available. This time, Pam Hupp did not occupy the same protected space she had during the first trial. The defense put her under a brighter light, not as an alternate suspect necessarily, but as a person whose actions, finances, and influence deserved scrutiny. Jurors heard about the insurance policy. They heard about the money. They heard details that had been largely absent from the first proceeding. The effect was subtle but powerful. Pam stopped feeling like background. She stopped feeling like scenery. Every murder case contains people the audience naturally looks past because they seem familiar enough to trust. During the second trial, the defense worked carefully to prevent that from happening. Jurors were encouraged to examine everybody, not just Russ. That shift alone altered the emotional balance inside the courtroom. The prosecution still had a case, but the defense now had room to breathe. As testimony unfolded, the prosecution's timeline faced a problem it had never fully escaped: the game night alibi. Years earlier, detectives had believed the timeline worked. Now the defense forced everybody back into it again. Witnesses described the evening. Travel times were examined. The narrowness of the state's theory became harder to ignore once jurors spent enough time inside the details. The defense did not need to prove exactly what happened inside Betsy's house. They needed to create reasonable doubt. And reasonable doubt grows most easily in tight spaces. The timeline remained one of those spaces. Jurors listened, attorneys argued, witnesses answered questions. The certainty that once carried the case forward no longer moved as smoothly through the courtroom. For the first time, the prosecution found itself having to defend assumptions it previously treated as settled facts. Outside court, attention around Pam continued increasing. Reporters noticed it. Observers noticed it. People following the case noticed it. Questions that barely existed during the first trial now surfaced regularly in discussions surrounding the murder. Why had she received the money? How much influence had her statements exerted over investigators? Why had the first jury heard so little about her? The shift wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative. Each question made the next one easier to ask. Each answer generated another conversation. Pam still publicly occupied the role of friend and witness, but the unquestioned trust surrounding that role had started eroding. The case was no longer organized around a single suspect standing alone in the spotlight. The spotlight itself had begun moving. Then came the outcome that had once seemed impossible. Russ Faria was acquitted. The man who had gone to prison for murdering his wife walked out of court no longer convicted of the crime. Supporters cried. Family members embraced. Years of pressure released all at once inside hallways, parking lots, and courthouse steps. But the acquittal did something larger than just free Russ. It created a vacuum. Betsy Faria was still dead. The murder had not disappeared. The crime scene remained real. The killer remained unidentified. The story that had once answered that question had collapsed under its own weight. And whenever one explanation collapses, investigators are forced to confront the same question all over again. If Russ didn't kill Betsy Faria, then who did? Somewhere else in Missouri, Pam Hupp was still living her life. For the first time since Betsy's murder, investigators would soon begin looking in her direction for reasons that had nothing to do with helping the prosecution. For years, investigators, prosecutors, reporters, and much of the public had operated inside a framework where the central question seemed answered. Once that answer collapsed, the case suddenly looked different. The same evidence existed, the same witnesses existed, the same murder sat at the center of everything. But now people were looking at the story from the opposite direction. Instead of asking why Russ killed Betsy, investigators had to confront a more uncomfortable possibility. What if they had spent years looking at the wrong person? The question carried consequences far beyond one overturned conviction, because every conclusion built on top of the original theory had to be re-examined too. The renewed attention did not immediately transform Pam Hupp into a suspect. At first, it simply transformed her into a subject of interest. That distinction mattered. Investigators revisiting the case began examining portions of Pam's story that had once been accepted with little resistance. Not because they had evidence she committed murder, but because they needed to understand whether earlier assumptions had prevented other possibilities from being fully explored. Old interviews and summaries came back out. Timelines were reconstructed. Financial records received fresh scrutiny. People who had once been interviewed primarily about Russ now found investigators asking questions that circled back toward Pam instead. The center of gravity inside the case had shifted, not dramatically, gradually, but unmistakably. One issue kept resurfacing: the insurance money. The policy itself had never disappeared from the case. What changed was the perspective from which people viewed it. When Russ was the defendant, the insurance policy often appeared as supporting context surrounding Betsy's fears and the state's theory of the marriage. After the acquittal, the policy stood on its own. A woman had been murdered. A friend received $150,000. Investigators now had to ask questions that once sat largely in the background. What conversations occurred before the beneficiary change? How involved was Pam in those discussions? What happened to the money afterward? The questions were not proof, but they were legitimate, and unlike before, investigators no longer had a competing prosecution consuming all of their attention. As investigators worked back through the case, another pattern became difficult to ignore. Pam seemed unusually successful at influencing how people understood Betsy. Friends described Betsy. Family described Betsy. Co-workers described Betsy. But Pam often described Betsy in ways that directly reinforced major themes inside the prosecution's former theory: fear, distrust, financial concerns, marital tension. Investigators began comparing those descriptions more carefully against statements from other people who knew Betsy. They weren't searching for dramatic contradiction. They were looking for proportion, looking for balance, looking for whether one voice had shaped the narrative more than it should have. The exercise revealed something subtle but important. Pam had not merely participated in the story surrounding Betsy's death. She had helped define it. Meanwhile, Pam continued living publicly as she had for years. The murder investigation no longer dominated headlines the way it once had. Most people were not studying court filings or revisiting old testimony. Outside the circle of people deeply connected to the case, life moved forward. That normalcy created its own kind of danger. People often assume investigations end when attention fades. Some of the most important developments happen after the cameras leave. Investigators worked quietly. Defense attorneys continued asking questions. Reporters who stayed interested kept pulling at loose threads. And little by little, the distance between Pam Hupp and the center of the investigation began shrinking. Nobody knew where that road ultimately led. But for the first time since Betsy Faria was murdered, it was Pam, not Russ, who increasingly found herself at the end of investigators' questions. The shift toward Pam did not happen because investigators suddenly discovered a hidden confession or a piece of evidence that solved everything overnight. The movement was slower than that, more frustrating, more realistic. People started noticing that the closer they looked at Pam, the more unusual her behavior seemed. Not necessarily on the day Betsy died, but afterward. Most witnesses drift away from the center of a homicide investigation as time passes. Pam did the opposite. She remained woven through the story. Interviews, media coverage, insurance decisions, conversations about Betsy's fears, conversations about Russ. The more investigators revisited the years surrounding the case, the harder it became to separate Pam from the narrative that had sent Russ to prison. That realization did not make her a suspect, but it made her impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the people who had spent years fighting for Russ's freedom found themselves in a strange position. For a long time their goal had been singular: prove Russ did not kill Betsy. Now Russ was free. The conviction was gone, but Betsy was still dead. The emotional relief surrounding the acquittal slowly gave way to another question entirely. What happens if the wrong man spent years in prison while the real killer remained untouched? Friends who once spent their energy defending Russ began paying closer attention to the broader mystery itself. Some revisited old interviews. Others followed reporting connected to Pam. Still others simply watched, waiting to see whether investigators would finally follow the same trail defense attorneys had been pulling on for years. The story had changed shape. It was no longer about proving Russ innocent. It was becoming about identifying whoever benefited from his conviction. Then something else started attracting attention. Money. Not just the insurance policy itself, but what happened afterward. Investigators and reporters examining Pam's finances noticed a pattern that kept surfacing whenever discussions turned to the life insurance proceeds. The money had not simply sat untouched after Betsy's death. Questions emerged regarding where portions of it had gone and how it had been used. Those questions did not immediately establish criminal behavior, but they expanded the scope of interest surrounding Pam. The insurance policy had once felt like a supporting detail inside somebody else's murder case. Now it increasingly felt like a thread connecting multiple parts of the story together. One reporter later described the experience as pulling on a loose string and discovering it ran through far more of the sweater than expected. The deeper people dug, the more frequently that thread led back to Pam. At the same time, prosecutors and investigators found themselves confronting an uncomfortable institutional reality. The original case against Russ had not merely failed, it had succeeded. A jury convicted him. A judge sentenced him. Years passed before the conviction collapsed. That meant the mistakes surrounding the investigation were larger than a simple wrong turn. An entire system had accepted the wrong answer. Nobody liked discussing that part openly, but it lingered beneath nearly every conversation surrounding the reopened case. Because if investigators had become so convinced of Russ's guilt that alternative possibilities received insufficient attention, then understanding how that happened became almost as important as solving the murder itself. And sitting at the center of that question was Pam Hupp. Not because she had been accused, because she had been trusted. Then came a development nobody connected to the Faria case expected. Not a new witness, not a forgotten piece of evidence, not a surprise courtroom filing. A completely different crime. A man named Louis Gumpenberger answered an opportunity that seemed harmless enough on the surface. He was vulnerable, struggling, looking for work, the sort of person who often goes unnoticed by the wider world. His path was about to intersect with Pam Hupp's. At first, nobody connected that future encounter to Betsy Faria. Nobody imagined that the event would eventually force investigators to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about Pam. But sometimes a murder case does not break open because detectives solve the original crime. Sometimes it breaks open because the person responsible cannot stop creating new problems. And in the years after Russ Faria walked free, Pam Hupp was about to create a problem that investigators could not ignore. Years after Betsy Faria's murder, Louis Gumpenberger was living a life that had already been marked by hardship. He lived with physical and cognitive limitations stemming from a serious car accident years earlier. Friends and family described him as trusting, polite, and vulnerable to people who presented themselves as helpful. He spent much of his time looking for opportunities to supplement his income and maintain some independence. That made him exactly the kind of person who responds when an unexpected opportunity appears. In August 2016, Louis answered what appeared to be a job opportunity. Somebody offered work. Somebody offered money. Somebody arranged a meeting. Louis had no way of knowing that the person behind that meeting was Pam Hupp, or that the encounter would end with him dead. At the time, nobody connected the arrangement to Betsy Faria. Not publicly. Not yet. According to investigators, Pam spent weeks constructing the scenario. She allegedly used disguises, burner phones, false identities. She contacted Louis and convinced him to come to her home under the pretense of participating in work connected to a television production. The details varied depending on the version being presented, but the central point remained the same. Louis believed he was showing up for an opportunity. Pam knew exactly why he was coming. When Louis arrived at Pam's O'Fallon home, events unfolded rapidly. Pam later claimed that Louis forced his way inside carrying a knife and a list of instructions connected to a bizarre murder-for-hire plot. According to her story, she acted in self-defense and shot him. The explanation immediately attracted attention, not because investigators had already solved it, but because it sounded strange. Very strange. The details seemed to multiply rather than clarify. Investigators responded to the scene and encountered a situation that felt dramatically different from the original narrative surrounding Betsy Faria. This time, Pam was not simply a witness. She was the surviving participant. She was the person who fired the weapon. She was the person explaining what happened, and the explanation raised questions almost immediately. The alleged murder-for-hire plot involved a sprawling story in which Louis supposedly arrived carrying instructions to kill Pam and then stage her death as a suicide. According to Pam, the conspiracy ultimately traced back to Russ Faria. There was one enormous problem. Russ had an alibi, a documented one. He was more than 1,000 miles away at the time. The story collapsed almost as quickly as it appeared. Investigators who might have accepted Pam's explanations found themselves confronting a version of events that was increasingly difficult to believe. As detectives dug deeper into Louis Gumpenberger's death, the case against Pam started forming in ways that the Betsy Faria investigation never had. The focus wasn't on emotional narratives, it wasn't on interpretations of a marriage, it wasn't on who said they feared whom. It was concrete. Phone records, preparations, contacts, movements, planning. Investigators increasingly believed Louis had been selected because he was vulnerable and unlikely to understand what was happening until it was too late. The theory that emerged was chilling in its simplicity. Pam needed a victim. Pam needed a story. Pam needed somebody she could connect back to Russ. And Louis became the person placed inside that plan. For investigators revisiting Betsy's murder at the time, the implications were impossible to ignore. The woman who had helped send Russ to prison now stood accused of creating an entirely different crime built around the same target. The Louis Gumpenberger case changed everything, not because it immediately solved Betsy Faria's murder, but because it fundamentally changed how investigators viewed Pam Hupp. For years, questions surrounding Pam had existed mostly in the margins. Defense attorneys asked them, Russ's supporters asked them, a handful of reporters asked them. Now law enforcement was asking them too, and they were asking them while investigating a homicide that placed Pam at the center of the planning. The protective assumptions surrounding her began disappearing. The credibility she once enjoyed eroded. The trust investigators once extended became skepticism. As detectives assembled the Louis Gumpenberger case, another question sat quietly behind every interview, every document review, and every conversation involving Pam Hupp. If investigators now believed she was capable of orchestrating one murder, What did that mean for the woman who had died in Troy years earlier? Betsy Faria's name had entered the room again. And this time, it wasn't Russ's shadow hanging over it. It was Pam's. The investigation into Louis Gumpenberger's death did more than expose weaknesses in Pam Hupp's story. It gave investigators something they had never truly possessed during the original Faria investigation. A chance to observe Pam as the central figure in a case instead of a witness standing beside one. That distinction changed everything. Detectives working on the Gumpenberger case weren't inheriting assumptions from another investigation. They were building their own. They watched Pam's explanations evolve. They compared statements against evidence. They examined preparation, planning, and behavior before and after the shooting. The result was a picture that looked dramatically different from the image many people had accepted during the years after Betsy's murder. For the first time, investigators weren't asking whether Pam was credible. They were asking whether she was truthful. And those are very different questions. As the case against Pam strengthened, people connected to Betsy's murder found themselves watching events unfold with a mixture of vindication and disbelief. Russ, Joel Schwartz, friends from game night, supporters who had spent years insisting something was wrong. None of them had predicted Louis Gumpenberger, none of them could have. Yet here they were, watching investigators build a homicide case around the same woman whose statements had helped secure Russ's conviction years earlier. The emotional reaction wasn't celebration, it was closer to shock, because every new allegation involving Pam forced people to revisit old assumptions surrounding Betsy's death. Conversations that once sounded speculative suddenly felt less speculative. Questions that once seemed unreasonable no longer sounded unreasonable at all. The ground beneath the original case continued shifting, and it wasn't shifting in Russ's direction. Eventually, prosecutors charged Pam Hupp with the murder of Louis Gumpenberger. The charge itself carried enormous weight, not because Louis's case and Betsy's case were identical, certainly not, but because the allegations revealed a pattern investigators believed they could prove. According to prosecutors, Pam selected a vulnerable victim, constructed a false narrative, positioned herself as the target, and attempted to direct suspicion towards someone else. Those allegations immediately attracted attention from people who had spent years studying the Faria case. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Again, investigators believed Pam had shaped a story. Again, another person ended up dead. Again, initial suspicion pointed where Pam wanted it pointed. The similarities didn't prove what happened to Betsy, but they forced people to ask questions that had once seemed much easier to dismiss. While the Gumpenberger prosecution moved forward, the investigations surrounding Betsy's murder continued evolving behind the scenes. Detectives revisited witnesses, revealed older materials, compared information gathered years apart. What made this stage different from earlier phases of the case was perspective. Investigators were no longer evaluating Pam through a lens of trust. They were evaluating her through a lens of scrutiny. Details that once seemed ordinary received a second look. Statements received a second look. Timelines received a second look. The process wasn't dramatic. Most breakthroughs aren't. They emerged from patient comparison and accumulated doubt. By then, years had passed since Betsy's murder, yet her case had become more active rather than less. The questions surrounding her death were no longer fading with time. They were multiplying. Then came one of the most significant developments in the entire saga. Pam Hupp pleaded guilty to the murder of Louis Gumpenberger. The plea removed any lingering ambiguity about how investigators viewed her conduct in that case. She would spend the rest of her life in prison for Louis's murder. But even that wasn't the end, because Louis's death had never been the question drawing the most attention. The larger question remained waiting. Betsy Faria, the woman whose murder launched everything that followed. The woman whose husband lost years of his life to a conviction that ultimately collapsed. The woman whose case had been overshadowed repeatedly by courtroom battles, appeals, and competing narratives. Now, investigators had a convicted killer sitting in prison. A killer whose actions had forced them to reconsider years of assumptions, and increasingly, all roads were leading back toward the same house in Troy, Missouri, back to the same December night, back to Betsy Faria. The charge everyone had been waiting for finally arrived in 2021. Pam Hupp was charged with Betsy Faria's murder. Nearly a decade had passed since the night Betsy was found dead beside the couch in her home. Nearly a decade had passed since investigators built a case against Russ. Nearly a decade had passed since jurors convicted him, sent him to prison, and accepted a version of events that ultimately collapsed. Now the focus rested where many people believed it should have rested years earlier. Pam. The announcement landed differently than Russ's arrest had. Russ's arrest felt like a conclusion. Pam's felt like a reckoning. For Betsy's family, the moment carried relief, frustration, grief, and exhaustion all at once. The murder that had shattered their lives in 2011 still remained unresolved in the most important sense. A charge was not a conviction, a theory was not a verdict, but after years of watching the case travel down the wrong road, investigators were finally walking in a different direction. As prosecutors prepared the case against Pam, the broader shape of the story became impossible to ignore. Betsy Faria was murdered. Pam Hupp received the insurance money. Pam became one of the most influential voices shaping investigators' understanding of Betsy's marriage. Russ Faria was convicted. Russ Faria was exonerated. Louis Gumpenberger was killed. Pam Hupp pleaded guilty to that murder. The sequence stretched across years and multiple courtrooms, but when viewed together it formed a pattern that was difficult to dismiss. The woman who once stood near the edge of the story had gradually moved toward the center until there was nowhere left to hide from the attention. Reporters who had covered the case for years found themselves returning to old notebooks and archived footage. Detectives who worked different phases of the investigation revisited events that once seemed settled. Family members who had spent years grieving found themselves answering the same questions again, only now the names attached to those questions had changed. The case had come full circle, but it did not feel complete yet. Then another unexpected development arrived. In 2023, Pam Hupp entered an Alford plea in Betsy Faria's murder case. The plea allowed Pam to maintain her innocence while acknowledging that prosecutors possessed enough evidence to likely secure a conviction at trial. The result ended the long path toward a murder trial that many people expected would finally produce a definitive courtroom answer. Instead, the case concluded in a way that mirrored much of its history. Complicated, unsatisfying to some, relieving to others. Pam received a life sentence. There would be no dramatic cross-examination revealing every answer. No final witness unexpectedly tying together every loose thread. No single courtroom moment capable of erasing the years Betsy's family endured or the years Russ spent in prison. Real life rarely offers that kind of ending. The legal system reached its conclusion. The emotional questions remained harder. For Russ, the ending looked different than many people imagine when they hear the word exoneration. Walking free did not restore the lost years. It did not give Betsy back. It did not erase prison. It did not erase being publicly labeled a murderer. The acquittal mattered. The overturned conviction mattered. The recognition that investigators got it wrong mattered, but none of those things reversed time. Russ spent years fighting to prove something that he knew from the beginning, that he did not kill his wife. The people who stood beside him during the fight carried their own scars from the experience, friends who never stopped believing him, family members who endured years of uncertainty, attorneys who refused to abandon a case that many others viewed as finished. Their victory was real, but so was the cost. In the end, the story of Betsy Faria became something larger than a murder investigation. It became a story about certainty, about what happens when investigators become convinced before every question is asked, about how a compelling narrative can overpower inconvenient facts, and how difficult it is to reverse course once institutions commit themselves to the wrong answer. And it became a story about persistence, because the truth did not emerge through sudden revelation. It emerged because people kept asking questions long after they were told the case was solved. A defense attorney who refused to stop digging. Friends who refused to abandon what they remembered. Reporters who refused to let the story disappear. Investigators who eventually looked again. At the center of everything stood Betsy Faria, a wife, a mother, A woman whose murder launched more than a decade of court battles, false conclusions, shattered lives, and relentless questions. The case that began with a husband accused of killing his wife ended with a different woman serving life in prison. And the road between those 2 points remains one of the most extraordinary failures and eventual corrections in modern American criminal justice. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.
If you like the show, please subscribe, review, and tell your friends. You can find us on social media at Kinda Murdery or email at kindamurdery@gmail.com.